This is essentially Arif Virani's argument. Trust me, bro.
Arguments concluded on Wednesday in the appeal of Judge Mosley's decision on the Emergencies Act use. The government tried to overturn the lower court's ruling that invoking the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. So, what's an appeal? What were the arguments? And where do we go from here?
Let's take a look. So Christine Van Gyn of the Canadian Constitutional Foundation decided to write an article in the National Post. And the headline reads, Christine Van Gyn, court ruling condemning use of Emergencies Act must be upheld. Trudeau government seeks to overturn landmark decision regarding Freedom Convoy.
The Federal Court of Appeal is hearing a once-in-a-generation civil liberties case February 4th and 5th, the appeal and the legal challenge to the Emergencies Act. This is the appeal of a landmark decision of the federal court from January 2024. In that lower court decision, Justice Richard Mosley sided with the legal charity, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which had challenged Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's invocation of the extraordinary legislation in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy.
Just a quick comment that this is such a landmark decision that you know how many mainstream media outlets are talking about it outside of the National Post?
I'm going to guess 0.
Virtually none. Isn't that interesting?
Well, they don't want to make the Liberals look bad, not right before an election.
And not in the middle of a Liberal leadership race. Let's continue.
Justice Mosley found that there was no national emergency and no threat to the security of Canada, which are legal requirements built into the Act to prevent it from being abused. He also found that the orders freezing bank accounts violated the constitutional right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that the restrictions on protests violated the right to freedom of expression. The decision was a blow to the Trudeau government, which announced its intention to appeal within minutes of the release of the nearly 200-page decision. The Trudeau government had spent over $2.2 million fighting the CCF in that case, only to lose on almost every measure. For the appeal, the government has hired new private sector lawyers whose high hourly rates will be paid with taxpayer money.
Now, Christine is not exaggerating when she says that the Trudeau government announced within minutes of the decision coming out that they were going to appeal. That's literally what happened. Within 10 minutes of this decision coming out, 200 pages. Arif Virani, the new Minister of Justice and Attorney General, said that he didn't agree with the decision. And therefore, they were going to be appealing. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brock mentioned this at an event earlier, and he's spot on. If you know anybody, and I mean anybody, that can read and comprehend and fully understand a 200-page court legal decision within 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, that person is a certified genius and they need to be up for some sort of Nobel Prize or something.
Or maybe they're a computer.
Or maybe they're a computer. Because, yeah, obviously they didn't read a single word of it other than the fact that, you know, they lost and they needed to try and save some sort of face and appeal the decision. So they already spent $2.2 million on the first case, and now we're into the appeal. Let's keep going.
This appeal will be heard by a 3-judge panel in Toronto. The focus of the CCF's argument to dismiss the appeal is the fact that the definition of, quote, threats to the security of Canada, end quote, which the Emergencies Act makes clear means the same thing that it means under the CSIS Act, was not met. Then CSIS Director David Vignon had informed the government that the definition was not met, and Cabinet failed to wait for an alternative assessment of the facts before invoking the Act. Another focus of the appeal is the level of deference owed to Cabinet in its decision to invoke the Act. The government is claiming that Cabinet essentially has unfettered discretion. This goes against the actual text of the Emergencies Act, as well as the history and context of the legislation, which was enacted to ensure there were proper guardrails on the legislation so it could not be abused like its predecessor, the War Measures Act.
So there's a lot in there. What does it all mean? Well, so we've gone over the Emergencies Act before, and we've touched on the definition of threats to national security in a recent video. But the long and the short of it is that the Emergencies Act, especially under the public order emergency, and that's what we're talking about here, specifically refers to the CSIS Act on the definition of national security threats. So much so that there's actually a link in the Emergencies Act to take you over to the CSIS Act so that you actually have a definition.
Yeah, if you're viewing it online.
Right. Now, what does it mean when it's saying, deference and unfettered discretion? Well, the government's argument is that the court and everybody else should just defer to the judgment of cabinet that it was the right decision.
I don't think so. We should just let cabinet be able to determine whether or not they can take our rights away.
Right. So where is this coming from? Well, Christine referred to some testimony by then CSIS director David Vigneault, and that he stated to the Prime Minister that the definition of national security as a threat being breached hadn't been met. So let's go all the way back a couple of years ago to the Rouleau Commission when he testified in this. And there's some very interesting but concerning testimony that he gave. Let's take a look.
This statement that your understanding that the Emergencies Act definition of threat to the security of Canada was broader than the CSIS Act. Where did you get that understanding? I know Mr. Cameron said maybe we'd hear about it later, but I'd like to hear about it now.
So I asked for legal interpretation.
Okay. You asked the Department of Justice?
I did.
Okay, thank you.
This is the first huge red flag, and no doubt one of the red flags that Justice Mosley reviewed when he was considering his decision. So what that essentially means is that allegedly there was this broader interpretation of what a threat to national security means as a result of what was in the Emergencies Act. And who decided that? Well, Mr. Trudeau's own government, the Department of Justice. And that's who David Vigneault allegedly consulted. Now, you may have heard about this legal opinion that has never been released from the Trudeau government on the justification of why they invoked the Emergencies Act. This is what they're referring to, folks. Justice Mosley hasn't even seen it. Nobody has seen it. Why? Gee, I wonder. But this is the thing. They're essentially trying to redefine what a threat to national security is and reinterpret it and add legal context to the Emergencies Act itself to be able to then justify invoking it, which they can't do because it specifically says in the Act, you must follow the definition in the CSIS Act for what a national emergency is.
Yeah, it's them getting caught doing something they shouldn't have and then trying to correct the act after they've already done it. You can't do that. You can't do that in law. You can't do that in life. You can't do that.
Well, and so what is going on with this appeal? Well, a court appeal is actually not retrying the whole case, because retrying the whole case took months and it led to a decision, and we have that decision. So appealing a decision is very specific. You're not asking for, reinterpreting all the evidence. What the appeal is, and what these judges are meant to decide, is if Judge Mosley applied the law correctly.
Right. So sometimes with appeals, an individual might say, well, I'm appealing this ruling because maybe my lawyer didn't do something correctly, or maybe the opposing lawyer didn't do something correctly, or maybe the judge didn't do something correctly, or the jury, or what have you. It's usually something has gone wrong with the procedure of how this court case was conducted.
Now, the main problem that the government has is they're essentially saying, well, they're arguing that Justice Mosley didn't include deference enough in his decision, meaning he should have just trusted that Cabinet did what they were supposed to do, which is completely contradictory of what the whole act is supposed to be in the first place. Remember, the Emergencies Act used to be the War Measures Act. And the reason why it's no longer the War Measures Act is because Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad, applied that in order to put down dissenting opinions in Quebec. And they arrested 500 people and held people for longer than they should have been. These arrests were carried out without warrants. It was crazy. So they said, well, government shouldn't just be able to enact this whenever they want without justification. So we're going to change this into the Emergencies Act and put in guardrails to make sure that that didn't happen. So the government is actually arguing, well, you just need to trust us and we should be able to enact it at our discretion, and you need to trust that it's properly done.
No, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
Yeah, not at all. So this is what these judges are supposed to be deciding, is whether Judge Mosley applied the law incorrectly. But let's continue with this testimony from David Vigneault.
But your view was that based on this broader understanding
Yes.
of threats to the security of Canada, the Act should be invoked.
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to go through, and Mr. Cameron went through some of the timeline here. You had an interview with Commission Counsel on, I believe it was August 29th. And in that interview, you noted that you had only learned that the Emergencies Act referred to the CSIS definition of threats to the security of Canada when the government started to explore the possibility of invoking the Act. Is that right?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. And then Commission Counsel prepared a summary of that meeting, that interview with you and your colleagues. We've seen that, and that was produced earlier. And then you had this in-camera proceeding that took place. And I understand that again, you confirmed that it was CSIS's view that the definition of threats to security of Canada in the CSIS Act was not met during the convoy?
Yes.
Okay. And then under examination from the Government of Canada, this information that you advised the Prime Minister of your view that the Act should be invoked was disclosed for the first time. Is that right?
Yes, I believe it is, yeah.
So you said in your initial witness statement that you felt it was important to communicate at the IRG and to Cabinet that under CSIS's analysis, there wasn't a Section 2 threat.
What I wanted to be very clear, Mr. Commissioner, is that because it was very dynamic environment, very, a lot of moving parts, as we say. And I wanted people to be clear about how CSIS, we were analyzing the situation. And so people were talking about using different words in the media, everywhere. And we just wanted to bring a level of clarity. So that's why we said our assessment was very dynamic, and we continued to assess. But throughout that period, we wanted to make sure that people did not misinterpret based on everything that was being mentioned, that CSIS, we saw a threat to national security based on our act. So that was the purpose of us being very deliberate about that approach.
Okay, I guess, I mean, you understand that one of the purposes of this commission is to assess whether the act was properly invoked. Sorry, can you just answer audibly?
Yes.
Thank you. And I guess I'm wondering why you didn't think it was relevant when you met with Commission Counsel in August to note that you had in fact advised the Prime Minister that you believed the act should be invoked.
David, you can't say, hey, so the threat to national security didn't meet the threshold that is defined in the CSIS Act, and then all of a sudden say, well, we need some other interpretation, and then talk to the Justice Department where they say, oh, well, according to the Emergencies Act, which there is no definition in, by the way, it's a broader definition. And then turn around and say, yep, it's justified to enable the Emergencies Act. And then when you're asked about it in the commission, you actually don't volunteer to tell them that you advised the Prime Minister that it was a good idea to invoke the act. You're one of the most important opinions in this whole thing. You're the director of CSIS.
Right.
You're providing the recommendation of CSIS on behalf of CSIS.
And you get that definition from the CSIS Act.
Like this is the biggest problem that the government has in this whole thing, and this is where Justice Mosley completely shredded it in his ruling. He had a very, very strong ruling. So he's essentially saying, listen, if the Emergencies Act doesn't meet the definition that is set out in the Emergencies Act, which refers to the CSIS Act, the government can't just say, well, okay, so that didn't work, so let's just go to our own Justice Department, conjure up some new legal opinion based on their opinion that aligns with what we want to do, and then we're going to use that legal opinion as the justification to invoke the Emergencies Act. You can't do that.
No, the Emergencies Act is written the way it's written to protect the citizens. The government can't just decide, well, we don't really care about that. We're going to do what we want anyways.
So this is the thing. When these appeal judges are looking at how Justice Mosley applied the law, and this is just me being objective, they're going to find that he applied the law correctly, because it literally says in the Emergencies Act that the definition of national security and what a threat is to national security is in the CSIS Act. That's what Justice Mosley looked at. And so he's saying, okay, well, based on that, it didn't meet it, because the government was arguing economic threat. Guess what's not in the CSIS Act?
Economic threat.
Right.
Is it possible that they could change the CSIS Act to encompass an economic threat within it? Sure, a future government could do that, but they can't do it in the future and then point back to this and say, well, it says that it's a threat now.
Right. You can't retroactively do that.
Right.
And the government isn't even presenting their legal opinion, by the way, folks. They didn't present it in the first case. So the judge didn't even get to evaluate why the government did it, because they refused to actually present their legal opinion. Some would say there is no legal opinion. It doesn't exist, which is why they didn't do it. We don't know. The problem is that it doesn't exist in the eyes of the court because it wasn't presented as evidence. The only thing that was presented is the Attorney General for Trudeau's government said, well, you just have to defer, which is what deference means, defer to the fact that Cabinet made the right decision. That's all you need to worry about.
So what that is essentially saying is that, well, Cabinet said it was right, therefore it's right.
Right.
That is not correct at all. That's not how our justice system is built.
So we are very confident, folks, very confident after these 2 days and the arguments that have been made that this appeal, it's not going to fly. That the appeals court is going to look at this and agree with Justice Mosley.
But again, you never know what's going to happen. So when it does happen, when that ruling does come down, we will be sure to let you know about it.
Now, when is that going to come down? Well, this isn't like TV, so
it'll be a little while.
It'll be weeks, if not months, as they consider everything that was said in the appeal, as well as they're going to be reevaluating Justice Mosley and his methodology and his approach, and they're going to be comparing that against the law, the Emergencies Act, what was in the CSIS Act, and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're going to be considering everything as they approach this and they make their decision. But the good news is we're extremely confident that they're going to rule in favor, because this is essentially a Reef Ferrani's argument. Trust me, bro.